Good morning. For those waiting on the phone, Supervisor Simitian is stuck in traffic and expects to be here in approximately 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll start the meeting then.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This is the County of Santa Clara's Federal Affairs Advocacy Task Force. My apologies for the tardy start, but we have reached the hour of 10:15, so we're going to go ahead and begin with item number 1, which is the call to order. And I will ask the clerk to please call the roll and establish the presence of a quorum.
Supervisor Cortese? Here. And Supervisor Semidian?
Here.
Thank you. You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Quorum has been established, and I would like to particularly reference the fact that we're pleased to have Tom Pike from Congressman Ro Khanna's office with us today. We thank you for being here and thank the Congressman for sending you to be with us.
Thank you. Appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know we had folks from Prime Policy on the line. Are they still with us, notwithstanding the late start?
We're here.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, that takes us to item number 2, which is public comment. Public comment is that portion of our agenda set aside for comment by members of the public on non-agendized items that are properly within the jurisdiction of the task force. We have one card today. That's for Mr. Scott Largent. Mr. Largent, if you'd like to come on up. And as you know, we set aside up to 3 minutes for folks who speak under public comment. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Scott Largent. Oh, good. There's our microphone. I am figuring out new things every day down here. It's for a little while there, I was kind of stalling out there, and I kind of go back through old things. And the most recent thing that I'm figuring out, of course, nothing is fair here in Santa Clara County, and especially with our Superior Court. But I am figuring out how police departments and how city attorneys' offices and county counsel's office are rigging a lot of these trials and a lot of stuff that they're able to keep out of court files, such as different things about police reports. They make it very complicated, and they change names of sections of the police reports. I'm sure you guys are familiar with, a narrative, a synopsis. It just gives them an added tool to remove information. So when I was discussing a lot of the stuff that was rigged with my case, I figured out how they justified taking out an entire section. Now, the entire section that they took out, they tried to say, well, that's a supplemental. Well, that could be the narrative. I mean, they bounce it back and forth. And the best part about this is I go into internal affairs and I film them. And you watch these people squirm back and forth making up excuses. I do the same thing with the independent police auditor. And I just watch them squirm. And the power of doing that with me right now is I then take that video, I put an entire description about what they're actually doing, and then I put it up on YouTube. And I'm getting a lot of results putting this stuff up online. I spent the first 3 years of my sobriety filming everybody in this county. You guys know I have 3 or 4 cameras. I wanted to document my struggles. I wanted to document how hard it was to get sober in this county and what they did to prevent me from speaking up about the problems. So I said, hey, I'm just going to do it. So I kept filming and filming and filming, not just when I was protesting. I did it at meetings. And some stuff I think I went a little too far. And I understand there's laws associated with not filming in courtrooms, not filming in hallways, not filming in your guys' offices, but I got tired of getting lied to. And the real hard part in court, the real reason why I busted out that cell phone in there and pressed record is because the transcripts do not mesh up with what was going on in court. So when I requested transcripts from different people's proceedings, it's completely different than what I recorded. And that's pretty shameful right there. So I'm continuing to figure out all the little tricks, and the worst one of them all is when this county brings in retired judges. I call them the ringer, okay? You cannot discipline a retired judge. The Commission on Judicial Performance cannot do it. That's how you guys got victorious. When he would recuse a judge, you'd wheel in another half-dead judge off the golf course to handle the case. They're doing that with Susan Bassey's case right now. They had a new judge that was in there, and sure enough, they wheel in one that's been retired for 9 years. I consider that a scam here in Santa Clara County. It's not fair. Thank you.
And let me confirm with the clerk, we have no other speakers, I believe, under public comment. We do not. That takes us to item number 3, which is to approve the consent calendar. And Supervisor Cortese, if we could get a motion from you to that effect.
So moved.
Thank you very much. That is simply to approve the minutes of our September 5th meeting and to change the time at an upcoming meeting on November the 7th. So we have a motion from Cortese. We have a second from Semidian. We have no speakers, and without objection, unanimously approved. That takes us to item number 4, which is to receive verbal reports from the Chair and the Vice Chair. Supervisor Cortese, I have nothing to report this morning, and you?
No, I don't. Thank you.
All right, this is going to get us to the meat of the meeting very quickly. Thank you. And then the question is there a verbal report from the Office of the County Executive relating to items of interest to the task force? We know we'll be hearing on a number of these immigration issues in just a little bit, but anything else relevant to our work today?
One thing that we don't have specifically
Please.
scheduled on the agenda is action that needs to be done by the end of September on the Farm Bill, which has had a version passed in both houses, but the two versions are not the same, so they're working on resolution. Significant for us is the work requirements for food benefits in the SNAP program, which is in the House version, and we'll watch that closely to see how that plays out. And the rest of the issues going on will be talked about, I think, by Prime Policy, except for the hearings on Kavanaugh, which have taken up a huge amount of time in Washington, D.C. And that's all I have to say.
Comments or questions on this item? Supervisor Cortese.
Action on the Farm Bill. It sounded like the timeline. Sound like we're already a little past the timeline, if I heard you properly. But what are we looking for? A full board action, a support or oppose action?
Dr. Smith, you said September, and I don't know if that means September, which means
It
it's
expired
passed,
already.
It's expired already. All right.
What I mean is they need to get it passed with retroactivity. So I don't think we need to take an action from the board. We've already gone on record as supporting it.
Okay.
But I just wanted to let you know they've missed a important deadline with regard to the SNAP program.
I understand. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Anything else on this item? If not, then let's move on to item number 6, which is to receive the report from the Office of the County Council relating to items of interest to the task force. And here again, anything in addition to what we are going to take up under item number 8, where we have a focus today on various immigration-related issues.
Thank you, President Simedian. We've provided you with a report with updates on various actions that the county is either monitoring, participating in, or seeking to participate in your packet with the updates in red. My colleague, Lead Deputy County Counsel Laura Trice, is available to answer any questions, and I'll try and field them as well. But we don't have anything else beyond what's in your packet.
All right, thank you. Appreciate the updates, appreciate the ease in finding them because they are redlined, so thank you for that. Supervisor Cortese, anything on this item?
No, thank you.
All right, then we'll say thank you for that. We will move on to item number 7, which is the fiscal report from the Office of the County Executive relating to the fiscal year budget and appropriations process. Dr. Smith, anything from you or your team? Or the
Danielle Christian is going to take this one.
Ms. Christian?
Thank you, Danielle Christian, Legislative Manager, and I'm going to ask Prime Policy Group, which is on the teleconference line, to provide this report.
Great. Let's see how crisply the folks at Prime can untangle the federal budget and appropriations process for it. And please feel free to introduce yourself individually so we know who we're hearing from. Welcome.
Thank you, Supervisor Smitty. This is Rich Mead from Prime Policy Group, and I will try to do this quickly and then take any questions you may have about this. I'm going to focus first on the programs of greatest interest to the county, and then we can talk a little bit about the overall appropriations and budget process here in Washington. The Violence Against Women Act is funded at about the same levels in the House and Senate bills, and they've not yet resolved the difference between the two. It's $493 million in the House, $497.5 million in the Senate. The victims of trafficking is about $100 million in the House and about $85 million in the Senate. And again, this is still in limbo between the two bodies. Lastly, the House has put a cap on the Office of Victims of Crime program at $260 million, and the Senate bill does not have a cap. As as I mentioned, the Violence Against Women Act, that is the appropriations level. The overall authorization for that was continued forward to December 7th as part of the continuing resolution passed by Congress and signed into law by the President last month. Looking at the transportation appropriations bill, the Community Development Block Grant Program is funded at the same level in the House and Senate bills at $3.365 billion. The bill program, both the House and Senate bills have some significant reductions in that. The House has it about half of last year's level at about $750 million, and the Senate is at about $1 billion for that. That's down about half a billion from the 18 levels. The Women's Infant and Children's Program is funded at both the House and Senate bills, $6.15 billion. Also, the estimate for the SNAP program is at about $73 billion, which is almost $1 billion lower than last year's funding. And again, that's just an estimate of what's going to be spent. That's a mandatory spending program and is not actually appropriated directly. With that, a couple other comments. One is there's a discussion earlier about the Farm Bill, and it's true that the House and Senate did not reach agreement by the September 30th deadline. We are told that the programs that are funded by the Farm Bill have money and funds remaining in them that should flow until sometime in December. So that's really the more hard deadline with the Farm Bill. We expect that to get resolved during the lame duck session of Congress after the elections. Looking back to the appropriations process, Congress has passed 5 of the 12 appropriations bills, and then the continuing resolution funds the rest of the government. But those 5 appropriations bills fund about 3/4 of the federal government discretionary spending. So most of the appropriations work has been done. There's a 4-bill, what we call minibus, a cluster of 4 of the appropriations bills that's being worked out, and I'm told is fairly close to being resolved, and they'll probably act on that again after the elections. And then there's 3 other outstanding appropriations bills beyond that they'll need to resolve as well. With that, just in general, the House has adjourned and has left town until after the election. The Senate is still in session. They're in session this week. We anticipate they'll likely be in session next week, and then possibly go out after that. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you for the clarification. This is Supervisor's Committee, and thank you for the clarification on the Farm Bill funding. And not surprising that there are deadlines, and then there are real deadlines. So, but an important point. Supervisor Cortese, any questions on budget appropriations?
No, none. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Pike, I want to welcome you again and say if at any point you want to lean in, just lean in, push the button. I'll see the microphone illuminate, and I'm happy to hear from you either with questions or comments to help us through this conversation today. That does take us, thank you again to the folks at Prime. That takes us to item number 8, which is to receive a verbal report from the administration and the Office of the County Council relating to items of interest to the task force. And there are A through G, and as is I think readily apparent to those who've been following these issues, was our intention today to try and bring some focus to bear on immigration issues broadly defined or broadly understood. So why don't I start, Dr. Smith, with your nod and smile by going to Ms. Christian to lead us through this. As I'm seeing the nod, I'm seeing the smile, Ms. Christian. Apparently that's what I'm supposed to do. So we'll look to you. And we have a number of items here. I want to take our time, try and make sure we understand where we are, and perhaps most importantly, looking to both County Council and to the County Executive's Office, and let me just say this first chart puts the fear of God into me right off the bat, but want to sort of be thinking about what actions, if any, our board, our county should be taking to make the best of a challenging situation. So go to it.
Okay, thank you. Danielle Christian again. I'm going to provide just a very brief overview and reference the written report that was provided to the task force. And then County Council will provide a brief overview on the items focusing on the current status of each one from a legal perspective. Then the Office of Immigrant Relations will also provide some information for each population and discuss the chart a little bit. Finally, we have Prime Policy Group on the line to talk a little bit about the congressional outlook on immigration issues. And we're happy to take questions as the information is provided or save them for the end. But as you know, since taking office, President Trump has taken numerous actions on immigration policy that focus on more enforcement against unauthorized immigrants, stricter screening of legal immigrants, and overall reductions of people entering to and relocating in the United States. In our county of 1.9 residents, where more than 38% of the population is foreign-born and more than 180,000 residents are undocumented individuals, the administration's policies undoubtedly affect many people in our communities. The report that you have in your file talks about and provides information on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, the DACA program, which we've discussed quite a few times in this task force, as well as the board taking some action on that. There's also information on the executive order on sanctuary jurisdictions, which I think will be expanded on a little bit more by county council. Another executive order that President Trump issued was the Muslim travel ban, which after his third release is one that is currently in place. We also have information on the temporary protected status, which is legal status that's granted to people in the United States from designated countries that are facing extreme conflict, disaster, or severe violence situations. Recent announcements to end temporary protective status for people from those countries have been made by the Trump administration, leaving tens of thousands of people kind of in some sort of flux as to what their immigrant status would be, or whether they're going to be required to leave the country at the time that the TPS period actually ends. We also have information in your packet about H-1B and H-4 visa programs. The H-1B program allows companies in the United States to temporarily employ foreign workers in occupations that require theoretical or practical application of a body of highly specialized knowledge. In the information that I've reviewed, a lot of individuals in this area fall in the science technology area. H-1B visas are typically provided for 3 years and may be extended for 3 more years for a total of 6. In an executive order on Buy American and Hire American, the Trump administration states that it's its policy to exactly do that, hire American and buy American, and asked various departments, various federal agencies to suggest reforms to ensure that the H-1B visas are awarded to the most skilled or highest paid petitioners. There's an anticipated rule that is expected in January of 2019 that would limit who would qualify for an H-1B visa and restrict which companies would be eligible for one based on the employer-employee relationship. Related to H-1B visas are the H-4 visas, which is provided to eligible spouse or a child under the age of 21 of an individual who has an H-1B. In 2015, a regulation was enacted that would allow spouses who are H-4 status to have work authorization in the United States. A recent announcement, or the Department of Homeland Security has been developing a new rule to ban spouses of H-1B visa holders, so H-4 visa holders, from working in the United States. The rule is expected to be submitted within the next 3 months. Another area that has been a focus is reducing the cap of refugees who are admitted into the United States. In the middle of September, Secretary of State announced that the United States will admit at most 30,000 refugees in fiscal year 2019. And on background, the President, in consultation with Congress, determines the numerical ceiling for refugee admissions each year. The number of 30,000 refugees is the lowest that it's been since the passage of the Refugee Act in 1980. Finally, and most recently, is a proposed rule on the inadmissibility on public charge grounds. We talked a little bit about public charge in one of the executive orders one of the many executive orders that President Trump has released. And public charge means an individual who is likely to become primarily dependent on the government for subsistence, as demonstrated by either the receipt of public cash assistance for income maintenance or institutionalization for long-term care at government expense. An individual who's likely at any time to become a public charge is inadmissible to the United States and ineligible to become a legal permanent resident or obtain a green card. On September 22nd, the Department of Homeland Security announced a proposed rule, that would include the monetary value of benefits received via Medicaid, healthcare, and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, meaning food stamps. So the receipt of aid through either of those programs could be used in determining whether an immigrant applying for entry to the country or applying for a change in citizenship status, such as legal permanent status, is or may become a public charge. The Office of Immigrant Relations can talk a little bit more about that, as well as County Council. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or ask County Council to take over the information.
Supervisor Cortese, and then I have a comment question.
None, thank you.
I asked this question not in a capital P political vein, but in a trying to understand the small p political forces that are that we're going to have to confront. I could, and it may be that it's the folks at Prime, although I'll start with you, Ms. Christian. If you want to turn to Prime, that's fine, or if you and your colleagues there have a thought. You know, there are some of these administration positions that are focused on reducing the flow of even lawful immigration or affecting the immigration status of people who are here lawfully now. You mentioned TPS as an example, which I think might be more understandable in a political context or even in an economic context if we were in a time of high unemployment, because then we would hear the argument, which we've heard from the administration in the past, about who gets what jobs. What I have been perplexed by is the opposition to lawful immigration, or the push to focus on folks who are here lawfully now, given the fact that unemployment is, at a extraordinary low, and in fact, our employers are telling us they need the workforce to move forward. So, is there? And again, I'll look to you if you want to go to Prime, but I'm trying to understand. I say this not in a capital P political way, but it's hard to see this as anything other than capital P politically, because I can't understand an economic argument. Even allowing that I wouldn't buy the economic argument, I can't see the economic argument being made here. Is there anyone on the panel who wants to comment on this?
My thoughts, just in response, is that there's so many different programs and different segments of immigration policy. You've got people who've entered the country legally, people who are here because they're seeking a better life, and perhaps they haven't come through the quote proper channels. And I think all the different components are being just globbed into the individuals. We're not born here. They're not citizens, and I think that bigger picture is the focus, and the other parts, whether it's the justification, as you said, if it's an economic argument, that that could make a little bit more sense and could be a little bit more logical, but I don't think I don't think logic is what's driving some of the announcements and policies that are being put forth. And if Prime Policy has any more that they'd like to add on that, I would welcome its comments.
Thanks.
This is Mark. I'm sorry.
Go right ahead. And did you understand? I'm sorry, my question was a little rambling, but as I say, I'm trying to understand what the policy rationale is, and or what the political rationale is, just because I think we need to understand that as well to figure out where we're headed and how we manage that. And my question specifically is about legal immigration, which has increasingly become a subject that the administration is looking to. And as I say, I would understand it a little bit better if there was a significant case to be made for employment concerns, but I'm not seeing that given the numbers, and I'm trying to understand why we've been hearing more and more from the administration in the last year, for example, about lawful immigration or the status of folks who are here lawfully now.
Sure. This is Mark Disler at Prime Policy Group, and thank you for giving me a chance to talk with you about some of these things. I think that there is a political component of an across-the-board restriction-oriented outlook on immigration. I mean, it's across the board. I mean, the refugee numbers, I'll get back to legal in a second, but it, as Ms. Christensen mentioned, it's striking. I mean, 30,000 is the lowest ever. And I will tell you, I'll give you two reactions. Aside from the fact that I think he believes he's delivering on a promise and that taking actions to restrict immigrants, legal or illegal, is something that pleases his base and maybe in some general philosophical way, fulfills his, outlook on this. There has been a long-standing effort among those, some in the Republican Party, even some at one point, at least in some components of the union movement, that wanted to restrict some of the legal immigration categories going back decades, some of the worker categories, and some of the family relationship categories. So it's always been an undercurrent among those that have been trying to restrict immigration going back at least to the 80s and into the 90s as just part of an overall outlook on what our immigration system should look like, that we should have a finite number that we know each year comes into this country, and that was Al Simpson's big raison d'etre for some of the restrictions he wanted to do back then. And in terms of a policy rationale in this economic environment, to the extent one might come up with one, and frankly, I don't have any insight into what the Trump administration is thinking in terms of economics here, since unemployment is so low, and so many industries are crying for workers. It may be in part that they want to put in place a more permanent reduction and difficulty for immigrants to come in over time, looking forward, because there'll be times when unemployment might rise, and they want these jobs available for Americans. I mean, that's the only thing that I can think of at the moment, that even with low unemployment now, you have to take the long view, might be what they're thinking.
Thank you. That actually is, I think, a helpful reminder that there is a longer view, and that folks who currently have, from a capital P political standpoint now, if you've got control of the administration and both houses of Congress, I'm sure there are folks who are thinking this is the opportunity to put provisions in place that might endure, and I can follow that. Before we go on to the next part of the presentation, Supervisor Cortese, anything on the initial presentation?
At some point, I wanted to just
Mr. Pike, please.
give my 2 cents on that, just a little bit of information for you. I am the Director of Constituent Services for Congressman Khanna. We have about 250 cases at the moment, and 85% of them are immigration and visa related. So on a daily basis, we're dealing with a lot of this, and I support what is the comments that have just been made. It's not just the issues that we're facing, of course, more broadly, are not just kids at the border, not just undocumented members of our community that are being threatened, but it's also, as Supervisor Simidian pointed out, there does appear to be increasing restriction on legal immigration. What we are seeing in our office is people who are in the legal immigration process. Things are much slower. Things are tightening up, and even to the extent of visas, dealing with the Department of State, not just USCIS. If people are trying to come to the United States, even on tourist visas or business visas and things like that, things that in past years that have been allowed, increasingly people are not allowed to even visit the country. So it seems to be a broad-based front related to not only legal immigration, but even visitors from foreign countries. So there's a lot of data there that supports what's going on, and it's a great question as to what really is the policy behind this, because when you're talking to people who are in need and so on, it's kind of hard to explain to them sometimes. So thank you for addressing this on the county level. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Supervisor Cortese.
Yeah, I guess just, and I'm not going to say anything that hasn't been said already, so I'll keep it brief given that. And it's certainly just an editorial comment of my own, but, you know, I think the problem, and it goes back to the Obama administration as well, has been there really hasn't been a long view effort. You know, certainly President Obama attempted to put together some major legislation and did. You know, the Health Care Act being one of those. But there was never any effort to put together comprehensive immigration reform in the traditional legislative sense, and this administration hasn't done that either. And I'm not sure how far back that pattern goes, because it's all kind of a blur, even though I've been an elected official for over 25 years now. But it just seems that, you know, and maybe it's a crass view, but every 2 years there's an election, and this kind of you know, response to constituencies across the 50 states who are not doing as well as people in Silicon Valley is, look, globalization isn't such a great thing. You know, importing labor isn't such a great thing. Exporting, you know, offshoring isn't such a good thing when people are struggling in Middle America or in Juneau, Alaska, or wherever it is that they've got boarded up storefronts and people, you know, and boarded up factories. And it just becomes that. And of course, I think we all recognize or fear, you know, the undertones of racism to some extent going on as sort of a double whammy. So folks who can get political, make political hay out of, you know, people's disregard for what we call multiculturalism, and also, you know, disregard for anything that's going to send dollars somewhere other than into the pockets of folks who were born and raised here, becomes, you know, this very nasty political discussion. And I'm not sure if, you know, flipping the House and changes in Congress are going to resolve that, given what we've seen in terms of a pattern over the years. So that's just you know, my 2 cents on it. When I was president of the board 1 year just before President Obama's first term was up, he asked me, along with mostly mayors from across the country, to get on a conference call with him so he could vet what was his embargoed State of the Union address. And we had all received it ahead of time, and we were prepared with our comments across the board, whether it was Atlanta or Philadelphia or, you know, I chimed in here, even though we're, you know, this huge productive economy, about a couple sentences he had in the original draft, which talked about expanding these programs, H-1B and so forth, and America continuing to essentially push capitalism. It was rhetoric, but, you know, around the world, globalization. And across the board, every single local official on that call asked for those sentences to be removed, on the basis that the administration was asking those same local officials to disseminate immediately upon giving that address, you know, sort of attaboy comments or whatever you want to call those, kudos to the administration for calling for those measures. And people across the country were saying, you know, if I say that in my locale here, where we've got, you know, remember this is not that long after the Recovery Act, where we've got factories boarded up and we got people on unemployment and people looking for jobs, I'm going to be in trouble politically. And that was just a raw reality of the situation. And depending on your point of view, to his credit or not, he deleted those sentences from the speech. The speech was given without those comments. So I just want to say what I just said, that I wonder, you were talking about the small p or the big P in the political word, that this has just been one of those situations where a large part of the country doesn't have the same point of views as we do, and it seems to just completely neutralize or polarize any kind of effective long view on this issue, and these puts us in the position of doing this little chart here that we see in our packets of trying to put Band-Aids on everything to try to respond and protect people, especially here in our area. Anyway, sorry to go on, but thank you for acknowledging.
No, thank you, Supervisor. And I do think it's important that we do our best, understanding that some of this is always going to be speculative, to understand what the forces in play are. Because I think if we're going to take the long view, to use that term again, in terms of our own county work, we need to be mindful of what the coming years look like and what some of the forces are that are driving. And the comments from Prime, you know, as soon as you mentioned the desire to lay down a policy foundation that would survive over the longer term, you know, immediately the light bulb went on, and I thought, of course, that's, you know, I think part of the motivation, as we've discussed, is keeping promises, appealing to constituencies, but then on a more substantive level, taking the opportunity while you've got the clout to do it, to lay down a set of policies that will endure, perhaps, over the longer haul. So there we are. Ms. Christian, back to you, and who's next up?
County Counsel, and I'll ask her to introduce herself.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Laura Trice, Lead Deputy County Counsel. I'm going to give the current legal status of each of the immigration issues laid out in the agenda. I'm going to try to keep it brief and not repeat what Danielle has already said, but of course happy to provide more detail on any of the items. So to start, the rescission of the DACA program, the current status of that, over the past 10 months or so, federal district courts in California, New York, and DC have issued orders that partially halt the rescission of DACA. That includes the preliminary injunction order that was issued in the case that the county brought, along with the other cases brought in California by several other groups of plaintiffs. All of these orders have been appealed to the 9th, 2nd, and DC circuits. The 9th Circuit is most furthest along in that process, heard argument back in May, but still hasn't issued a decision. So still waiting to hear from the courts of appeals on those. In the meantime, though, as a result of the district court orders, the federal government is required to process DACA renewal applications. It is not required currently to consider initial DACA applications from people who didn't previously have DACA status, and it's not required to consider applications for advanced parole for people who go outside of the country and are seeking to re-enter. There is one other case related to the DACA rescission. This is a case in Texas brought by Texas and 6 other states who are suing to end the DACA program. They did request a preliminary injunction from the federal court in Texas to halt DACA entirely. The court rejected that request, basically finding that this program has already been ongoing for 8 years. People have relied on it. the court may or may not determine that it's unlawful, but in the meantime, the harm to DACA recipients of stopping the program until the litigation is resolved would be greater than the harm to the federal government. That court did, however, indicate that it thought it was likely that the DACA program is unlawful, so we'll see where that goes. Moving on to the executive order on sanctuary jurisdictions. I think you all probably know that about a year ago, a little bit less than a year ago, we did obtain a nationwide permanent injunction barring the Trump administration from implementing the funding stripping provisions of that executive order, and that order applied anywhere in the United States. On August 1st, the Ninth Circuit issued a decision largely upholding what the district court had done. It agreed that the executive order was unconstitutional and agreed that it was appropriate to issue a permanent injunction, at least within the confines of California. But it found that there was not enough, the district court hadn't made sufficient findings to support a nationwide injunction. So it sent the case back to the district court for further findings about whether a nationwide injunction is appropriate. So the case technically now is back in the district court. The government does still have time to file a cert petition to seek review by the Supreme Court. We don't know whether that's going to happen, but if it doesn't, there will be further proceedings in the district court about the nationwide scope of the injunction.
If you could pause for just a moment. And I mostly just want to get some of this out on the record, and I'll turn to Dr. Smith here in a minute. But so it's been a year and a half, 2 years almost now with the new administration, and of course this was one of the issues that we saw in early days of the new administration. What attempts, if any, have there been to actually withhold funding from our county as a function of this measure? And why don't I just stop there and let somebody answer that question?
So what the federal government has done once the executive order was enjoined, it moved forward to try to deny funding on a grant by grant basis. So there are certain criminal justice related grants that the Department of Justice has attached immigration related conditions to, and required local governments who are interested in receiving funding under those grants to certify, for instance, that they don't have any restrictions on the exchange of information about immigration status with the federal government, that they are willing to allow ICE agents to interview people in jails, that they are willing to notify ICE when an individual is going to be released from custody. The county is not currently applying for any of the grants that those conditions have been attached to. In part because of those conditions. So the federal government hasn't expressly denied any funding to the county, but we have declined to apply for certain funding. And there is litigation ongoing across the country about whether those conditions can be lawfully applied.
Let me just interrupt before I turn to the county executive. My own view, one of the underappreciated, undercommented upon pieces of this debate around the executive order on sanctuary jurisdictions has to do with the reasonable expectation taxpayers have that when they send their money to Washington, they'll get their fair share back for the needs of the community. And so while there's a focus, understandably and appropriately in my view, on the issue of cooperation with federal officials, and the sanctuary jurisdiction issue gets the sort of the larger coverage. You know, there's another issue here, and I know the litigation speaks to this, which is, telling local taxpayers that they're not going to get their fair share of federal funds because of a difference of opinion on one particular policy matter, I think, sort of is a whole other part of the conversation that I've been trying to stress from the beginning of this effort. I do, as I listen to you, it sounds to me like the administration has attempted to put these conditions on law enforcement related grants as opposed to things where the connection would be more tenuous. So I can understand the strategy and the tactics of that. I guess the question I would ask of the county executive, and while asking him to share any other thoughts he has on the subject, is you've indicated that there are grants that have had what I'll call preconditions or conditions attached that we have not applied for. And I think the important question that I would ask is, would we have applied for them and might we have received them but for those conditions? In other words, are we actually, your point, Ms. Rice, as I understood it, is we haven't technically had to deal with that issue because we simply haven't applied. And my question is, all right, would we have applied, and are we effectively being frozen out of participating in funding opportunities by virtue of those conditions? Dr. Smith, and then I'll look to Supervisor Cortese to see if he's got comments or questions on this piece.
These grants are very small amounts of money. We have not applied for them in the past. So I wouldn't say that the decision by the feds has affected our abilities to function and provide services. You're right, they did fall back to the position of focusing on funding that really has a nexus with ICE, and it does indicate, however, some significant intent from the administration to try to limit grants with placing conditions in them, but our litigation has stopped that for the moment, and we have not really been damaged financially, although the original threat was over $1.5 billion. We seem to be fairly stable at this point.
And the reason for that rather dramatically larger original threat number is that initially we were, the language in the executive order suggested that virtually any federal funding might be contingent, no matter how far afield it was from the issue of law enforcement and or ICE cooperation.
Correct. The original executive order was broad sweeping, basically any funding from the federal government, which is why County Council, with this board's direction, took the issue to court because it was overbroad and the executive order was fundamentally flawed to begin with legally. So that has been fended off, at least for now.
Thank you. Supervisor Cortese, on this piece of the item?
Yeah, going back to your original question, what attempts has there been? The only one I've seen personally was a letter we received not long after the initial preliminary injunction on the January 25th order that we're talking about here. No sooner do we get back home from San Francisco in that court hearing, we got a letter asking us to justify why we weren't in compliance with conditions on a grant we'd received. And lo and behold, we hadn't received the grant in the first place. So it was the real reaction at that point was, does anybody at Homeland Security really have their house in order? Sending letters out to folks who haven't even received grants, raises the question of whether they know who they've been giving, granting money to. That said, I know County Council responded to that. I think that was shared with the full board at the time, and we never heard another thing about it. But there has, my recollection, and I don't know if Mr. Meacher has the same recollection. It sounded like maybe Dr. Smith was alluding to that. I believe there were several cities, including San Jose, had received those grants, which were tied to the USC provisions, the 1373 provisions. And my understanding is that those conditions have been challenged in court separately. I don't recall if we've filed amicus briefs, but I don't think those cities who were asked to make good on those conditions just caved in. My understanding is that they've responded with lawsuits even on those USC 1373 related conditions.
I believe that's right. I'm going to ask Lead Deputy County Counsel Laura Trice to fill in any specifics.
Sorry, Laura, I probably should have directed that to you.
No, that's fine. Yeah, that's right. The grant that we received the letter about was the Justice Assistance Grant, and there has been litigation brought by Chicago, by San Francisco, by Philadelphia, challenging that requirement to comply with 8 U.S.C. 1373. The courts in Chicago and in Philadelphia have found that it's not constitutional to place those conditions on the grants, but those decisions are being appealed, so there's no final decision on it.
Well, thank you for updating us on that.
All right. Thank you. Let's continue.
Okay, so moving on to the Muslim travel ban. This, I think, as Danielle mentioned, the Trump administration had issued 3 successive versions.
Ms. Price, excuse the interruption. I apologize. It occurs to me important that I just lean in at this point and ask the folks at Prime if they had any comments they wanted to offer on the first 2 items, which were the rescission of deferred action for childhood arrival program, DACA, and or the second item, which was the sanctuary jurisdictions executive order. Please feel free to just speak up when the time comes. I know it can be a little difficult over the teleconference line. Anything on either of those before we move on?
This is Mark Disler at Prime. No, nothing on those 2 items, and I will feel free to ask to comment if appropriate.
Got it.
Yeah,
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then, Ms. Rice, thanks for letting me interrupt for a moment there. Back to item C under 8, which is the Muslim travel ban.
Thank you. So the Trump administration had issued 3 successive versions of the travel ban. All of them were challenged in multiple lawsuits across the country. The last version of that was issued in a proclamation. In June, the Supreme Court upheld the proclamation, that 3rd version of the travel ban. So the Supreme Court's decision effectively ended the sort of overall litigation challenging the travel ban, but there is still litigation ongoing, and that now relates to the waiver process that was outlined in the proclamation. So the proclamation provides a blanket and indefinite ban on travel from certain countries, but it does provide for a case-by-case waiver for individuals who don't present any security concerns for the United States and for whom it would be a hardship if they weren't able to enter this country, for instance, to visit relatives, to obtain medical treatment, things like that. But what these lawsuits allege is that the Trump administration has effectively refused to issue waivers and instead is just issuing blanket denials of waiver requests without considering individual circumstances. So the cases are challenging the implementation of the waiver process. They're all still in the early stages, so there aren't any court decisions to report, but we are monitoring those.
Thank you. Supervisor Cortese, anything on this item?
Okay. Moving on to temporary protected status. So since 2017, the Department of Homeland Security has announced the termination of TPS designations for Sudan, Nicaragua, Haiti, El Salvador, Nepal, and Honduras. There have been lawsuits filed across the country challenging the termination of TPS for these countries, but generally these lawsuits are also in the preliminary stages. There aren't any significant rulings to report. There is one case brought in the Northern District of California where the plaintiffs have requested a preliminary injunction to prevent termination of the TPS designations for El Salvador, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Sudan, but the court hasn't ruled on that request yet, so that we're monitoring those.
Let me just interrupt with a very practical question. I'm looking at the memo from Ms. Christian and Mr. Preminger, who's with us or has been for part of the hearing today, and at page 3 of 6, very handy chart indicating 10 countries are currently designated for TPS, 8 of which will terminate on designated dates over the next 16 months. That's a lot of folks. Is there any reasonable expectation that they will, in fact, return to their countries of origin, or are they simply going to remain here and become undocumented? And what does that, it's a practical matter, what does that mean? I mean, because that's a consequence that, you know, some significant number of folks here in Santa Clara County are going to have the potential to move from one status to another, and I'm trying to think through, looking ahead, what does that mean for folks in any one of those 8 different DPS programs? Ms. Love, are you the go-to person on this one?
Yes, thank you. Maria Love, Manager for the Office of Immigrant Relations. To address your question, Supervisor, from what we've seen based on similar programs that have ended, and because these immigrants who have been here living legally for a number of years have established lives, we've seen that they are choosing to stay and risk them sort of, you know, being detained and deported. As again, most of them have U.S. citizen children, and otherwise, if they decide to go back to their countries of origin, wouldn't otherwise be able to have anyone take care of their children. One of the things that we do have is, just to give you an idea of what the potential impact might be for our county, in 2016, according to USCIS, there was about 2,387 people who were on TPS that were residents of Santa Clara County. So my guess would be that, you know, if we were to sort of go back and look at more recent data, we may or may not see that number go up. So that sort of gives us an idea of what potentially the impact might be. But one of the things that we do hope and have been doing, along with a number of other community-based organizations, is really try to encourage those who may be transitioning out of TPS because their legal status is changing, is to sort of meet with attorneys to explore potentially other immigration relief that they could be transitioned into, so that we can avoid them becoming undocumented.
Thank you. Related, since I have stepped in at this point, there was earlier reference, I think it was in Ms. Christian's opening remarks, and forgive me if this is somewhere in the materials and I've just missed it, but to 180,000, an estimate of 180,000 folks in our county who are probably undocumented. Where does that number come from? How do we come up with that number?
So that number is an estimate from the Public Policy Institute of California, who actually in 2015, I believe, conducted a study to try to estimate the number of undocumented people in California, and that was their estimate.
And just to probe a little bit more, and that was an estimate that was specific to our county as opposed to simply taking our county's percentage of a total number for the state?
So that 180,000 is actually the state. We don't, at this point, are still trying to assess what the impact is at the county level, as that's very difficult data that hasn't really been able to be captured at this point.
Sure. Could I just ask for a follow-up off-agenda note on this? Because the 180,000, just to be clear, is for Santa Clara County, but it's based on state data. Yes? Is that what you're...
No, to clarify, the 180,000 is the total number of undocumented people in the whole state of California. So the number for Santa Clara County is much lower than that.
Supervisor Smitty, and I think that Maria and I need to connect and sift through the numbers and provide an off-agenda report that's more clear.
Please do. All right, thank you. Let me ask you to go back to your report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to H-1B and H-4 visas. On this item, I'll start with the H-4 visas because there's a little bit more concrete to report on those. So as Danielle mentioned, H-4 visas are issued to the spouses and children of people who are here on H-1B visas. And under an Obama administration rule, certain H-4 visa holders can obtain work authorization while they're here and while their spouse is seeking lawful permanent residence status, seeking to stay here permanently. DHS has indicated that it's working on a proposed rule that would end employment eligibility for H-4 spouses. DHS has stated that they expect to kind of have the rule more or less finalized on their end in about 3 months, after which it would go on to the Office of Management and Budget for further review and evaluation before it can actually be published and made available for comment by the public. So that is expected to happen in the fairly near future. In terms of H-1B visas, DHS has stated that it's considering a proposed rule that would impose more restrictive eligibility requirements for both H-1B visa applicants and also employers who wish to employ H-1B visa holders. In some regulatory submissions, DHS gave a target date of January 2019 for this proposed rule, but that date's not binding in any way. It could be much later than that, or it could never happen. We don't have a lot of details on the substance of what this proposal would do, but it would likely be restrictive. And then
go right ahead.
Moving on to refugee admissions. Again, as Danielle mentioned, on September 17th, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced a proposed refugee admission ceiling of 30,000 people for fiscal year 2019. That would be the lowest number of refugees, the lowest ceiling for refugees since the Refugee Resettlement Program was created in 1980. It appears that at this point this is still a proposal. Federal law requires the president to consult with the House and Senate Judiciary Committees before formally setting the annual refugee cap. When I looked this morning to see if there were any updates, Politico was reporting that this consultation actually happened on Monday, October 1st. It was supposed to happen before Monday, but it seems like it may have happened Monday afternoon. So I think we can expect a formal presidential determination to be issued sometime soon. That will be published in the Federal Register, and we have no reason to believe it will be anything different from the 30,000 cap that was announced.
And Ms. Rice, just to interrupt again for a moment, please, to clarify, the obligation to consult is just an obligation to consult, and once the consultation's taken place, there's essentially free rein to act without regard to what the consultation produced.
That does seem to be what the statute says.
Okay.
Yes.
Proceed.
All right, and then the last item is the proposed rule relating to inadmissibility on public charge grounds. And this is, the inadmissibility on public charge grounds is something that's relevant to immigrants who are applying to become lawful permanent residents, also people who are outside of the country and applying to enter the country, and it can also affect people who are here on temporary visas who are trying to switch to a different type of lawful visa. So it definitely applies to people who are here on lawful visas. DHS released an unofficial version of the proposed rule on September 22nd. As was already discussed a little bit, this proposal would expand the public benefits that are considered in determining whether an immigrant falls under the public charge definition and can be denied immigration status based on that. It would also change the definition of what a public charge is to sweep in potentially a much broader range of people. We expect the official proposed rule to be published in the Federal Register sometime soon, possibly this week. Once that happens, the public will have 60 days to comment on the proposed rule. I guess that's our presidential alert. So there will be 60 days for the public to comment on the proposed rule. DHS is then required to consider those public comments before it issues a final rule. So right now there's no change in the law. No change in the law will happen until a final rule is issued, and DHS could make substantial changes before issuing a final rule, or it could even decide not to issue a final rule at all.
That being said, assuming that the effort moves forward, I'm trying to think through, all right, what are the practical consequences for our county? And, you know, it sounds like the clear intent, again, is to discourage folks or limit folks from entering the country. But it also seems pretty clear that the clear result will be that fewer folks will be applying for services or benefits out of a concern that would adversely affect their immigration status. I don't know if the county executive has had a chance to sort of think through what the possible scenarios might be, but it seems to me, that we have the potential for two results. One is to have fewer folks asking for services, which, to some extent means there's a lesser demand. But at the same time, it also means that folks we're trying to encourage to avail themselves of services for the health and safety and well-being of their families and their communities are going to be increasingly reticent to do so, knowing that that's already been a challenge over the last couple of years. Dr. Smith, you have any thoughts on this? I'm trying to think through, all right, where might we be? That's probably a better way to put it.
Well,
a year or two from now, if this moves forward.
Right. From a staff perspective, we've been very concerned about this, not so much from the perspective of revenue, but rather from the perspective of people not getting services. So the one county marketing plan was the beginning of a organized messaging program to try to get into the communities that are likely to have these individuals and communicate to them that we are not not a danger, that we will not be reporting anybody who's undocumented to any federal agency. We also have done contracts with, or a contract with Univision to be able to do spot communication over the television. That contract's been a little delayed because of illness in the 11th floor, but we'll be moving ahead with it. So it's, from our perspective, the best I think we can do is an organized communication to the community to try to allay their fears. But we recognize that no matter what we do, there will still be fears.
We talked earlier, obviously, about the sanctuary jurisdictions, which is essentially an effort at the federal level to push local jurisdictions into cooperating with ICE. Have we had any indication from the federal government that there's a similar move afoot with respect to sharing information about who the recipients are of these benefits and services? In other words, has somebody said or suggested at the federal level that going forward we're going to have to provide immigration data or status information about the recipients of the SNAP program or WIC or other federal programs?
There's not, to my knowledge, been an explicit statement from the federal government that they will try to extract citizenship data from our other programs. However, as we talked about earlier with the SNAP program related to the Farm Bill, we're concerned that there might be workarounds that the feds are structuring that would actually get to similar information. So, for example, the work rules, depending on how they're structured and what data is required, could easily get us into trouble.
Well, let me just ask, and Ms. Christian, Ms. Trice, and Ms. Love, if you have any, if you're aware of any such efforts, now would be a good time to share them. I don't see anybody leaning in, or yes, no, Ms. Trice?
The only thing that I would say, I'm not aware of any of those efforts. That doesn't mean I'm certainly not aware of everything that the Trump administration is doing. I would note that I believe there was a leaked executive order early on in the Trump administration that addressed public charge and admissibility, and I believe that that draft included provisions about notice from state and local governments to the federal government about use of public benefits. That, so far, I believe, has been removed from this proposed rule, but that is certainly something they could consider reinserting.
I'm going to ask you to, and I see Ms. Love nodding her head, I'm going to ask you to put your heads together and then send us an off-agenda memo on that issue specifically, if you could, please, both what if there was in fact an unofficial and or leaked version that incorporated such language, and then also how the current proposal differs if it does. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Smith, as well as the rest of the team through him, to just please, and I guess this goes to County Council as well, so Mr. Mitra, if I can ask you to be sure to share with Mr. Williams. If the federal government starts to go down that path, I think it's important for our board to hear that at the earliest opportunity. I think we're, and just to sort of start thinking through how we want to respond, what steps we want to take. You know, there are a lot of different ways to come at these issues, and in addition to the ways that might be more apparent, there are some privacy issues here that are of particular concern to me as well that I'd want to be thinking through. Dr. Smith, I see you leaning in again.
Yes, I should have mentioned to the board, we, as the board members are very concerned about the census process. We've put a lot of effort, time, and money into the LUCA program locally and have been recognized by the state as being a model for starting to work on our census locally. But the concern that was raised with the question about citizenship is also one methodology which we're concerned about the federal government using to try to delineate public charge issues. Now, there is legal prohibition against census information being used in that way, but knowing this administration, it's not too hard to imagine law which would relax that legal prohibition.
Just out of this thought that I've had before, what happens if somebody fills out their census form, either hard copy or electronically, digitally, and simply declines to answer that question? What do they?
Good question. We don't have a good answer.
If there's an easy answer to that one, again, off agenda, it would be nice to know, because it's.
If I can just jump in real
Please.
quick. Yeah, I would,
Thanks,
the
Mr. Pike.
regional census representative, I think, is going around, is meeting with county. I met with them, and that's a very good question, because my impression is that their express policy is that they will follow up if, let's say, somebody fills out half of the census. They will, follow up and try to get additional information. The implication is if you fill out everything except, say, one question, that's not enough to be, followed up on. So you can extrapolate from there as to whether if that was the one question that wasn't answered, what would happen? Would there be something beyond their normal policy to target that, or whether they would just follow normal protocol and say, we got 99% of the information that we want, that's fine. And also whether if that information were, spread throughout the community, what impact that might have. So,
Is there a penalty, civil, criminal, or otherwise, for deliberately, inaccurately filling out a census form? Suppose any one of us in the room who is a U.S. citizen decides to say we've got 3 kids instead of 2, that we're single instead of married, what's the consequence of deliberate inaccurate information on a census form?
I think we would have to get back to you on that one.
Please do. I think as we're trying to think through where we're headed in the census effort, and credit to other members of the board who've really been leading this effort, questions pop up in my own mind as we listen to it, and to the extent that this immigration question is a high-profile concern, I thought, well, how are people going to, again, I asked myself, all right, what's the practical consequence of this? And you think, well, some people might think, I just won't answer. And then the obvious question is, well, if someone doesn't answer, does that mean they're going to be singled out for special attention? Or perhaps even a source of greater concern to Dr. Smith's program is, do you get put in the list of people who possibly aren't citizens because you didn't answer that question? And, while that may seem a little paranoid, we're at a time where I think those are the kinds of things you have to ask yourself about. And then that means that somebody might think, well, I better not leave the question blank, so I'll just fill it out and say I am a citizen when I'm not. So then does that constitute an unlawful behavior? In all the years I've been filling out the census during the course of my lifetime, I've never had reason to pause and ask myself, am I putting myself at risk with an inaccurate answer to a question? Most of them have been pretty straightforward. But I think it would be useful to know because I think it's about to get real. So, all right, thank you. Anything else on the item proposed rule relating to admissibility on public charge grounds?
That was all I had.
Great. Anything from the folks at Prime on either this item or other items that we've covered?
This is Mark Visler at Prime. I mean, I know I think there's going to be a discussion about what the task force or the county can do. One thing it can do on some of these items on that proposed rule on inadmissibility on public charge grounds, I mean, if so inclined, can file a comment on it. I think it's a 60-day period, which happens to fall approximately around Thanksgiving, oddly. The other thing I'll just quickly mention, and I know I'll be giving a brief report on the political aspects of this going forward, but of the whole issue. But on refugee admissions, there's some thought among some of the Republicans in the House that they ought to enact legislation that takes back from the president the right to set the number. Now, that's not going to go anywhere right now, and may not go anywhere ever. But even though it's been cut way back, there's some thought that it shouldn't be the president who determines this in the first place anymore, anyway. But that's just something that we might keep an eye on going forward. But other than that, I'll wait until I have a chance to.
Well, I think this is the chance, so I would take it if I were you.
Well, I can talk about what we can expect going forward. If this is the right time, let me do that then.
Please do.
Okay. So, House is out of session. Senate's focused on other things. When we get to the lame duck, the continuing resolution, which provides funding through December 7th, will be its expiration will be the occasion of another brawl over wall funding for the president's southern border wall. I have no idea how that will turn out or how the results of the midterm elections might affect it. It is possible that if the Republicans lose one, let alone both houses, they might try to slip in their version of some of the issues on this list, but that's not likely. For example, would they try to address DACA in this next CR while they still control both houses? It's not really likely that that would move forward because there's no reason why the Democrats who in the Senate have something to say about what happens in this lame duck, since you need 60 votes, why they wouldn't want to wait until January when they're in the majority if that happens in one of these two houses. So you have the wall funding coming up in the lame duck and how that may play out. Now, much of there's really only speculation at this point because so much turns on the election. If the House of Representatives flips to the Democrats, and there's the conventional wisdom is that it will, but we'll have to wait and see. I would expect that the House will send to the Senate in the next Congress DACA legislation on temporary protected status, and probably a little later on in the next Congress, probably a comprehensive immigration reform bill. Now, when all of these things get sent to the Senate, even if the Democrats take the Senate, they would need, it's not likely that they're going to have more than, say, 51 or 52 seats if they do take the Senate, and would need Republican support to move anything that the House sends them. And at the back of the process, of course, is a presidential veto. So one thing I'll just briefly say to you to look for if the House flips, and frankly, a discussion, whether it's with staff or otherwise, after the election about immigration is going to be a conversation that'll be more focused because we'll know what has happened. But if one House goes to the Democrat, particularly if it's the House of Representatives where a simple majority will prevail, I would look for them, aside from sending over DACA legislation, TPS legislation, a comprehensive bill, all of which will be subject to Senate filibusters or presidential vetoes, I would look for the Democrats in Congress, in the House, to try to jam pieces of their agenda into must-pass legislation in the two sessions of the next Congress. So that they would put to the president that they would put to the Republicans the potential of a shutdown, which the Republicans generally want to try to avoid, at least in Congress, if they don't allow some relief, say, for TPS recipients, for example. All of this is highly speculative, and that's why my report is going to be as short as it is, and ask if anybody has any questions about this. And I'll end my own little brief presentation by noting, like a lot of other people, I didn't expect the November 2016 elections to go the way they did. Even into that evening of election night, I didn't expect Trump to prevail. So, strange things can happen. The Republicans might wind up retaining control of both houses. It's not expected at the moment. But if they do, we'll see very little action on immigration other than potentially restrictive efforts. So let me stop there because I know we've been talking about all this for a long time. And if there are questions, maybe that's a better way to go forward.
No, thank you. One of the reasons, Supervisor Cortese, that this task force exists and you were instrumental in its creation was to try and make sure that we were ahead of the curve in terms of anticipating what the consequences of a change in the administration and a change in the Congress meant for our county. And so looking to both the CEO and the COO, I think what I would ask of Dr. Smith and Ms. Marquez is that we focus to the extent we can in an uncertain time on contingency planning, for lack of a better phrase, for our county, for the real work that we do in the light of either impending or possible changes in immigration policy. And I'm thinking specifically, obviously, of the DACA young people, the proposed public charge rule, which really does affect the way we do our work, the potential for some significant number of folks who are here lawfully under the TPS program to find themselves undocumented and having to live their lives in a very different way than they have previously. I want to sort of continue to exhort the administration and our entire team to sort of be thinking a little bit ahead so that we're not caught off guard. I think we certainly scrambled, and the chart that's still up with our various program investments is some indication of how we scrambled as quickly as we could in a very rapidly changing political climate to provide services and to address the needs that arose. But I think, as I said, thinking ahead a little bit about some of these things and playing out some of the what-if scenarios and thinking about how we would respond will put us in a better position. So why don't I just stop there and see if there's anything else before I turn to my colleague, Supervisor Cortese. All right, Supervisor Cortese, any comments or questions at this point?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pike, anything else you want to share or ask us to be mindful of as we go forward in our work?
No, thank you, but it's been very helpful, and I appreciate the opportunity. We'll have an ongoing relationship. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and let me just make sure that we put you together with my staff person here who's helping with the committee, make sure that we got you either electronic or hard copies of everything that was made available to the rest of us, just because it may help connect the dots between what's happening at the federal level and here at the county level. And again, thank you to you and to Representative Khanna for breaking out the time and having you with us here today.
Great. You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, then, if that is in fact the last item, and I believe it is,
You
I'm
do,
looking to the
you do have a
clerk.
speaker card on that one.
Say one again.
You have a speaker card on that item.
Thank you. I do have one card, and the card is from Mr. Largent, who appears to have stepped out, and I don't know if he's just in the lobby, in which case we can wait a moment, or if not, we'll do a second and final call. Is Mr. Largent here to speak to item number 8? Apparently not. He may have simply left the building. All right, then, having made that offer not once but twice, without objection, that is the last item, and we stand adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.